The Sirens of Titan by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Chapter 1. Between Timid and Timbuktu. Everyone now knows how to find the meaning of life within himself. But mankind wasn't always so lucky. Less than a century ago, men and women did not have easy access to the puzzle boxes within them. They could not name even one of the 53 portals to the soul. Gimcrack religions were big business, and mankind, ignorant of the truths that lie within every human being, looked outward and pushed ever outward. What mankind hoped to learn in its outward push was who was actually in charge of all creation, and what all creation was all about. Mankind flung its advance agents ever outward. Eventually, it flung them into space, and into the colourless, tasteless, weightless sea of outwardness without end. It flung them like stones. These unhappy agents found what had already been found in an abundance on earth, a nightmare of meaninglessness without end, the bounties of space, of an infinite outwardness. Were there empty heroics, low comedy, and pointless death, outwardless, lost, at last, its imagined attractions. Only inwardness remained to be explored. The only human soul remained was terra incognita. This was the beginning of goodness and wisdom. What were the people in olden times with their souls as yet unexplored? The following is a true story from the nightmare ages, falling roughly, give or take a few years, between the Second World War and the Third Great Depression. There was a crowd. The crowd had gathered because there was to be materialization. A man and his dog were going to materialize. They were going to appear out of thin air, wispily at first, becoming finally as substantial as any man and dog alive. The crowd wasn't going to get to see the materialization. The materialization was strictly a private affair on a private property, and the ground was empathetically not invited to feast its eyes. The materialization was going to take place like a modern, civilized hanging within high, black guarded walls. And the crowd outside the walls, very much like a crowd outside the walls of a hanging. The crowd knew it wasn't going to see anything, yet its members found pleasure in being near, in staring at the blank walls and imagining what was happening inside, the mysteries of the materialization, like the mysteries of a hanging. They were enhanced by the wall. They were made pornographic by the magic lantern slides of morbid imaginations. Magic lantern slides projected by the crowd on the blank stone walls. The town was Newport, Rhode Island, USA. Earth, Solar System, Milky Way. The walls were those of the Rumford estate. 10 minutes before the materialization was to take place, agents of the police spread the rumor that the materialization had happened prematurely, had happened outside the walls, and that the man and his dog could be seen as plain as day 2 blocks away. The crowd galloped away to see the miracle at the intersection. The crowd was crazy about miracles. At the tail end of the crowd was a woman who weighed 300 pounds. She had a goite, a caramel apple, and a grey little 6-year-old girl. She had the girl by the hand and was jerking her this way and that, like a ball on the end of a rubber band. "Wanda Jane," she said, "if you don't start acting right, I am never going to take you to another materialization again." The materialization had been happening for 9 years, once every 59 days. The most learned and trustworthy men in the world had begged heartbrokenly for the privilege of seeing a materialization. No matter how the great men worded their requests, they were turned down cold. The refusal was always the same, a handwritten by Miss Rumford, her social secretary. Miss Winston Niles Rumford asks me to inform you that she is unable to extend the invitation you request. She is sure you will understand her feeling in the matter, that the phenomenon you wish to observe is a tragic family affair, hardly a fit subject for the scrutiny of outsiders, no matter how nobly motivated their curiosities. Miss Rumford and her staff answered none of the tens of thousands of questions that were put to them about the materializations. Miss Rumford felt that she owed the world very little indeed in the way of information. She discharged it incalculably small obligations by issuing a report 24 hours after each materialization. Her report never exceeded 100 words. It was posted by her butler in a glass case, bolted to the wall next to the one entrance of the estate. The one entrance to the estate was an Alice in Wonderland door in the West Hall. The door was only 4.5 feet high. It was made of iron and held shut by a great Yale lock. The wide gates of the estate were bricked in. The reports that appeared in the glass case by the iron door were uniformly bleak and peevish. They contained information that only served to sadden anyone with a shred of curiosity. They told the exact same at which Miss Rumford's husband Winston and his dog Kazak materialized, and the exact time at which they dematerialized. The states of health of the man and his dog were invariably appraised as good. The reports implied that Miss Rumford's husband could see past the future very clearly, but they neglected to give examples of sights in either direction. Now the crowd had been decoyed away from the estate to permit the untroubled arrival of a rented limousine at the small iron door in the west wall. A slender man in clothes of the Edwardian dandy got out of the limousine and showed a paper to the policeman guarding the door. He was disguised by dark glasses and a false beard. The policeman nodded, and the man unlocked the door himself with a key from his pocket. He ducked inside and slammed the door behind himself with a clang. The limousine then drew away. "Beware of the dog," a sign said over a small iron door. The fires of the summer sunset flickered among the razors and needles of broken glass set in concrete on the top of the wall. The man who had let himself in was the first person ever invited by Miss Rumford to a materialization. He was not a great scientist. He was not even that well educated. He had been thrown at a University of Virginia in the middle of his freshman year. He was Malachi Constant of Hollywood, California, the richest American and a notorious rake-hell. "Beware of the dog," the sign said, outside of the small iron door. But inside the wall there was only a dog's skeleton. It was a cruelly spiked collar that was chained to the wall, and it was the skeleton of a very large dog, a mastiff. Its long teeth meshed its skull and jaws, formed a cunningly articulated, harmless working model of a flesh-ripping machine. The jaws closed so, clack. Here had been the bright eyes, there the keen ears, there the suspicious nostrils, there the carnivore's brain. Ropes of muscle had hooked here, and had brought the teeth together in flesh so, clack. The skeleton was a symbolic prop, a conversation piece installed by a woman who spoke to almost no one. The dog had died at its post there by the wall. Miss Rumford had brought the bones from a veterinarian, had had them bleached and varnished and wired together. The skeleton was one of Miss Rumford's many bitter and obscure comments on the nasty tricks Time and her husband played on her. Miss Winston Niles Rumford had $17 million. Miss Winston Niles Rumford had the highest social position attainable in the United States of America. Miss Winston Niles Rumford was wealthy, healthy, and handsome, and talented too. Her talent was as a poetess. She had published anonymously a slim volume of all poems called Between Timid and Timbuktu. It had been reasonably well received. The title derived from the fact that all the words between Timid and Timbuktu, in very small diaries relate to time. Oh, for fuck's sake, I fucked that up. I'll do that again, I'm sorry. Her talent was... Okay, that's fuck up number one, okay? So I don't think I can edit that out. Okay, I'll keep going, okay? Sorry. Her talent was as a poetess. She had published anonymously by a slim volume of poems called Between Timid and Timbuktu. It had been reasonably well received. The title derived from the fact that all the words between Timid and Timbuktu in very small dictionaries relate to time. Wow. But well endowed as Miss Rumford was, she still did troubled things, like chaining a dog's skeleton to the wall, like having the gates of the estate bricked up, like letting the famous formal gardens turn into the New England jungle. The moral, money, position, health, handsomeness, and talent aren't everything. Malachi Constant, the richest American, locked the Alice in Wonderland door behind him. He hung his dark glasses and false beard on the ivy of the wall. He passed the dog's skeleton briskly, looked at his solar-powered watch as he did so. In 7 minutes, a live mastiff named Kazakh would materialize and roam the grounds. Kazakh bites, Miss Rumford had said in her invitation, so please be punctual. Constance smiled at that. The warning to be punctual. To be punctual meant to exist as a point, meant that as well as to arrive somewhere on time. Constant existed as a point. Could not imagine what it would be like to exist in any other way. That was one of the things he was going to find out, what it is like to exist in another way. Miss Rumford's husband existed in another way. Winston Niles Rumford had run his private spaceship right into the heart of an uncharted chronosynclastic infundibulum. 2 days out of Mars. Only his dog had been along. Now Winston Niles Rumford and his dog Kozak existed as a wave phenomena, apparently pulsing in a distorted spiral with its origin in the sun and its terminal, oh god, Betelgeuse? What the hell is that word? Okay. Well, the Earth was about to interpret this spiral. So almost any brief explanation of the chronosynclastic infundibula is certain to be offensive to specialists in the field. Be that as it may, the best brief explanation is probably that of Dr. Cyril Hall. He appears in the 14th edition of A Child's Cyclopedia of Wonders and Things to Do. The article is in here reproduced in full with gracious permission from the publishers. And it goes as follows. A chronosynclastic infundibula. Just imagine that your daddy is the smartest man who ever lived on Earth. And he knows everything there is to find out, and he is exactly right about everything. And he can prove he is right about everything. Now imagine another little child on some nice world a million light years away. And that little child's daddy is also the smartest man who ever lived on that nice world, so far away. And he is just as smart and just as right as your daddy is. Both daddies are smart, and both daddies are right. If they ever meet, they would get into a terrible argument, because they wouldn't agree on anything. Now, you can say that your daddy is right, and the other little child's daddy is wrong, right? But the universe is an awfully big place. There is room enough for an awful lot of people to be right about things and still not agree. The reason both daddies can be right and still get into terrible fights is because there are so many different ways of being right. There are places in the universe, though, where each daddy could finally catch on to what the other daddy is talking about, and these places where all the different kinds of truths fit together as nicely as the other parts in your daddy's solar watch, we call these places chronosynclastic infundibula. So the solar system seems to be full of chronosynclastic infundibula. There's one great big one we are sure of that likes to stay between Earth and Mars. We know that one because Earth Man and Earth Dog flew right into it. You might think it would be nice to go to a chronosynclastic infundibulum and see all the different ways to be absolutely right, but it is a very dangerous thing to do. The poor man and his poor dog were scattered far and wide, not just through space, but through time as well. Chrono means time. Synclastic means curved towards the same side in all directions, like the skin of an orange. Infundibulum is what the ancient Romans, like Julius Caesar and Nero, called a funnel. If you don't know what a funnel is, get Mummy to show you one. The key to Alice in Wonderland had come with the invitation. Malachi Constant slipped the key into his fur-lined trouser pocket and followed that one path that opened before him. He walked deep into a shadow, but the flat rays of the sunset filled the treetops with a Maxfield Parish light. Constant made small motions with his invitation as he proceeded, expecting to be challenged at every turn. The invitation's ink was violet. Miss Rumford was only 34, but she wrote like an old woman, in a kinky, barbed hand. She plainly detested Constant, whom she'd never even met. But the spirit of the invitation was reluctant, to say the least, as though written on a solid, soiled handkerchief. During my husband's last materialization, she said, in her invitation, he insisted that you be persistent for the next. And present, of course. Dear. I was unable to dissuade him from this. Despite the many obvious drawbacks, he insists that he knows you well, having met you on Titan, which I am given to understand is a moon of the planet of Saturn. There was hardly a sentence in the invitation that did not contain the verb insist. Miss Rumford's husband had insisted on her doing something very much against her own judgment, and she in turn was insisting that Malachi Constant behave as best he could, like a gentleman, which he was not. Malachi Constant had never been to Titan. He had never, so far as he knew, been outside the gaseous envelope of his native planet, the Earth. Apparently, he was about to learn otherwise. The turns in the path were many, and the visibility was short. Constant was following a damp green path, the width of a lawnmower. What was in fact the swath of a lawnmower. Rising on both sides of the path were the green walls of the jungle the gardens had become. The mower's swath skirted a dry fountain. The man who ran the mower had become creative at this point. He had turned the path into somewhat of a fork, and Constant could not choose the side of the fountain on which he preferred to pass. Constant stopped at the fork and looked up. The fountain itself was marvellously created. It was a cone described in many stone ways of holding balls decreasing in diameter. The balls were collars of a cylindrical shaft 40 feet high. Impulsively, Constant chose neither one fork nor the other, but climbed the fountain itself. He climbed from ball to ball, intending when he got to the top to see whence had he come, and whither he was bound. Standing now in the smallest barouche, fountain bowls, standing with his feet in the ruins of birds' nests, Malachi Constant looked out over the estate, and over a large part of Newport and Narragansett Bay. He held up his watch to the sunlight, letting it drink in the whirl that the solar watches. Right, so letting the solar watch drink, and solar watches drink sunlight. Oh my god, this is crazy. Okay. He held up his watch to the sunlight, letting it drink in the wherewithal that was to solar watches what money was to earthmen. The refreshing sea breeze ruffled Constance's blue-black hair. He was a well-made man, a light heavyweight, dark-skinned with poet's lips, with soft brown eyes in the shaded caves of the Cro-Magnon brow ridge. He was 31. He was worth $3 billion, much of it inherited. His name meant faithful messenger. He was a speculator, mostly in corporate securities. In the depressions that always followed his taking of alcohol, narcotics, and women, Constant pined for just one single thing, a message that was sufficiently dignified and important enough to merit his carrying it humbly between 2 points. The motto under the coat of arms that Constant had designed for himself said simply, "The messenger awaits." What Constant had in mind, presumably, was a first-class message from God to someone equally distinguished. Constant looked at his solar watch again. He had 2 minutes in which to climb down and reach the house. 2 minutes before Kazakh would materialize and look for strangers to bite. Constant laughed to himself, thinking how delighted Miss Rumford would be were a vulgar, parnell Mr. Constant of Hollywood to spend his entire visit treed on the fountain by a thoroughbred dog. Miss Rumford might even have the fountain turned on. It was possible that she was watching Constant. The mansion was a minute's walk from the fountain, set off from the jungle by a mowed swath, 3 times the width of the path. The Rumford mansion was marble, an extended reproduction of the banqueting hall of Whitehall Palace, London. The mansion, like most of the really grand ones in Newport, was a collateral relative of post offices and federal court buildings throughout the land. The Rumford mansion was hilariously impressive, with expressions to the concept of people of substance. It was surely one of the great essays on density since the Great Pyramid of Khufu. In a way, it was better to perceive as an essay on performance than the Great Pyramid, since the Great Pyramid tapered to nothingness as it approached heaven. Nothing about the Rumford mansion diminished as it approached heaven. Turned upside down, it would have looked exactly the same. The density and permanence of the mansion were, of course, at ironic variance with the fact that the quondam master of the house, except for 1 hour and 59 days, was no more substantial than a moonbeam. Constant climbed down from the fountain, stepping onto the rims of the bowls of ever-increasing sizes. When he got to the bottom, he was filled with a strong wish to see the fountain go. He thought of the crowd outside, thought of how they too would enjoy seeing the fountain go. They would be enthralled, watching the teeny-weeny bowl at the tippity-tippity top brimming over into the next little bowl, and the next little bowl, and so on. A rhapsody of brimming, each bowl singing its own merry water song, and yawning under all those bowls that was upturned to the mouth of the biggest bowl. The biggest of them all, a regular Beelzebub of a bowl, bone-dry and insatiable, waiting, watching for that first sweet drop. Constant was rapt, imagining that the fountain was running. The fountain was very much like a hallucination, and with hallucinations, usually drug-induced, were almost all that could surprise and entertain Constant any more. Time passed quickly, and Constant did not move. Somewhere on the estate a mastiff bayed. The baying sounded like the blows of a maul on a great bronze gong. Constant woke from his contemplation of the fountain. The baying could only be that of Kazak, the hound of space. Kazak had materialized. Kazak smelled the blood of the parvenu. Constant sprinted the remainder of the distance to the house. An ancient butler in knee breeches opened the door. For Malachi Constant of Hollywood, the butler was weeping for joy. He was pointing into a room that Constant could not see. The butler was trying to describe the thing that made him so happy and so full of tears. He could not speak. His jaw was palsized, and all he could say to Constant was, "Put, put, put, put. Put, 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 put." The floor of the foyer was a mosaic, showing the signs of the zodiac encircling a golden sun. Winston Niles Rumford, who had materialized only a minute before, came into the foyer and stood on the sun. He was much taller and heavier than Malachi Constant, and he was the first person who had ever made Constant think that there might actually be someone in the room more superior to himself. Winston Niles Rumford extended his soft hand, greeted Constant familiarly, almost singing his greeting in a glottal, groton tenor. "Delighted, delighted, delighted, Mr. Constant," said Rumford. "How nice of you to come." "My pleasure," said Constant. "They tell me you are possibly the luckiest man who ever lived." "That might be putting it a little too strong," said Constant. "You won't deny you've had fantastically good luck financially," said Rumford. Constant shook his head. "No, that would be hard to deny," he said. "And what do you attribute this wonderful luck of yours?" said Rumford. Constant shrugged. "Who knows?" he said. "I guess somebody up there likes me," he said. Rumford looked up at the ceiling. "What a charming concept, someone liking you up there." Constant, who had been shaking hands with Rumford during the entire conversation, thought of his own hand suddenly as small and claw-like. Rumford's palm was calloused, but not horny like the palm of a man doomed to a single trade for all his days. The calluses were perfectly even, made by the 1,000 happy labours of an active leisure class. For a moment, Constant forgot that the man whose hand he shook was simply one aspect, one node of a wave phenomenon, extending all the way from the sun to Betelgeuse. The handshake reminded Constant that it was that he was touching, for his hand tingled with a small but unmistakable electrical flow. Constant had not been bullied into feeling inferior by the tone of Miss Rumford's invitation to the materialization. Constant was a male and Miss Rumford was a female. And Constant imagined that he had the means of demonstrating, if given the opportunity, his unquestionable superiority. Winston Niles Rumford was something else again, morally, spiritually, socially, sexually, and electronically. Winston Niles Rumford's smile and his handshake dismantled Constant's high opinion of himself as effectively as a carnival roustabout might dismantle a Ferris wheel. Oh, okay, a carny, as they say. Constant, who had offered his services to God as a messenger, now panicked before the very moderate greatness of Rumford. Constant ransacked his memory for the past proofs of his own greatness. He ransacked his memory like a thief going through another man's billfold. Constant found his memory stuffed with Rumford. Constant found his memory stuffed with rumpled. Overexposed snapshots of all the women he had had, with preposterous credentials testifying to his ownership of even more preposterous enterprises, with testimonials that attributed to him virtues and strengths that only $3 billion could have. There was even a silver medal with a red ribbon awarded to Constant for placing second in the hop, skip, jump, and intramural track meet at the University of Virginia. Rumford's smile went on and on. To follow the analogy of the thief who was going through another man's billfold, Constant ripped open the seams of his memory, hoping to find a secret compartment with something of value in it. There was no secret compartment and nothing of value. All that remained to Constant were the husks of his memory, unstitched, flaccid flaps. The ancient butler looked adoringly at Rumford, went through the cringing contortions of an ugly old woman posing for a painting of the Madonna. "The master," he bleated. "The young master." "I can read your mind, you know," said Rumford. "Can you?" Constant said humbly. "Easiest thing in the world," said Rumford. His eyes twinkled. "You are not a bad sort, you know," he said, "particularly when you have forgotten who you are." He touched Constant lightly on the arm. It was a politician's gesture, a vulgar public gesture by a man who in private among his own kind would take winsome pains never to touch anyone. "If it's really so important to you at this stage of our relationship to feel superior to me in some way," said Constant pleasantly, "think of this. You can reproduce, and I cannot." He now turned his broad back to Constant, led the way through a series of very grand chambers, and he paused in one, insisted that Constant admire a huge oil painting of a little girl holding the reins of a pure white pony. The little girl wore a white bonnet, a white stretched dress, white gloves, white socks, and white shoes. She was the cleanest, most frozen little girl that Malachi Constant had ever seen. There was a strange expression on her face, and Constant decided that she was worried about getting the least bit dirty. "Nice picture," said Constant. "Wouldn't it be too bad if she fell into a mud puddle?" said Rumford. Constant smiled uncertainly. "My wife as a child," said Rumford abruptly, and he led the way out of the room. He led the way back down the corridor and into a tiny room hardly larger than a broom closet. It was 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, and had a ceiling, like the rest of the rooms in the mansion. But they were all 20 feet high. The room was like a chimney. Let me repair the imagination there. So he led the way down a back corridor and into a tiny room hardly larger than a big broom closet. And this room, it was 10 feet long, 6 feet wide, and had a ceiling. And like the rest of the rooms in the mansion, 20 feet high. So we can imagine this. And the room was like a chimney, and there were 2 wing chairs in it. "An architectural accident," said Rumford, closing the door and looking up at the ceiling. "Pardon me," said Constant. "This room," said Rumford. With a limp right hand, he made the magical sign for a spiral staircase. "It was one of the few things in life I ever really wanted, with all my heart, when I was a boy. It was this little room." He nodded at the shelves and ran 6 feet up the window wall. The shelves were beautifully made. Over the shelves was a driftwood plank that had written on it, in blue paint, "Skip's Museum." Skip's Museum was a museum of mortal remains, of endoskeletons and exoskeletons, of shells and coral and bone, cartilage and chiton. of dotels and orts and residua of souls long gone. Most of the shipments were that of a child. Most of the specimens were those that a child, presumably Skip, could find easily on the beaches and in the woods of Newport. Some were obviously expensive presents to a child, extraordinarily interested in science and biology. Chief among these presents was the complete skeleton of a human adult male. There was also the empty suit of armor of an armadillo, a stuffed dodo, and the long spiral tusk of an owl, playfully labelled by Skip, Unicorn Horn. "Who's Skip?" said Constant. "I am Skip," said Rumford. "Was." "I didn't know," said Constant. "Just in the family, of course," said Rumford. Said Constant. Rumford sat down in one of the wing chairs, motioned Constant to the other. "Angels can't either, you know," said Rumford. "Can't what?" said Constant. "Reproduce," said Rumford. He offered Constant a cigarette, took one himself, and placed it in a long bone cigarette holder. "I'm sorry my wife was too indisposed to come downstairs to meet you," he said. "It isn't you she's avoiding, it's me." "You?" said Constant. "That's correct," said Rumford. "She hasn't seen me since the first materialization." He chuckled ruefully. "Once was enough." "I'm sorry," said Constant. "I don't understand." "She didn't like my fortune-telling," said Rumford. "She found it very upsetting, and what little I told her about her future, well, she doesn't care to hear any more." He sat back in his wing chair, inhaled deeply. "I tell you, Mr. Constant," he said, genially, "it's a thankless job, telling people it's a hard, hard universe they're in." "She said you told her to invite me," said Constant. "She got the message from the butler," said Rumford. "I dared her to invite you, or she wouldn't have done it. You might keep that in mind. The only way to get her to do anything is to tell her she hasn't the courage to do it. Of course, it is an infallible technique. I could send her a message now, telling her that she doesn't have the courage to face the future, and she would send me back a message saying I was right." "You really can see into the future?" said Constant. The skin of his face tightened and felt parched. His palms perspired. "In a punctual way of speaking, yes," said Rumford. "When I was in my spaceship and I ran it into the Cronus Clastic Infundibulum, it came to me in a flash that everything that ever has been will always be. Everything that ever will always be has been." He chuckled again, knowing that rather takes the glamour out of fortune telling. Okay, sorry, that was a quote. Oh, I really want to read that one thing right again, because it's one of my favorite lines. So, everything that ever has been, always will be, and everything that ever will be, always has been. He chuckled again. "Knowing that rather takes the glamour out of fortune-telling, makes it the simplest, most obvious thing imaginable." "You told your wife everything that was going to happen to her?" said Constant. This was a glancing question. Constant had no interest in what was going to happen to Rumford's wife. He was ravenous for the news of himself. In asking that about Rumford's wife, he was being coy. "Well, not everything," said Rumford. She couldn't quite tell. She wouldn't let me tell her everything. What little I did tell her quite spoiled her appetite for more." "I see," said Constant, not seeing it all. "Yes," said Rumford genially. "I told her that you and she would to be married on Mars." He shrugged. "Not married exactly," he said, "but bred by the Martians, like farm animals." Winston Niles Rumford was a member of the true American class. The class was a true one because its limits had been clearly defined for the last 2 centuries. Clearly defined for anyone with an eye for definitions. Rumford's small class had come a 10th. From Rumford's small class had come a 10th of America's presidents, a quarter of its explorers, a third of its eastern seaboard governors, and a half of its full-time ornithologists. Three quarters of its great yachtsmen, and virtually all of its underwriters of the deficits of the Grand Opera. It was a class singularly free of quacks, with the notable exception of political quacks. The political quackery was a means of gaining office, and it was never carried into private life. Once in office, members of the class became, almost without exception, magnificently responsible. If Rumford accused the Martians of breeding people as though people were no better than farm animals, he was accusing the Martians of doing no more than his own class had done. The strength of his class depended on some extent to sound money management, but depended to a much larger extent on marriages, based cynically on the sorts of children likely to be produced. Healthy, charming, wise children were the desired. The most competent, if humorless, analysis of Rumford's class is, beyond question, Walter Kittredge's The American Philosopher Kings. It was Kittredge who proved that the class was in fact a family, with its loose ends neatly turned back into a hardcore singularity. Oh my god, this is hard. Okay, I'll try it again. Wow. Okay. So it was Kittredge who proved that the class was in fact a family, with its loose ends neatly turned back into a hard core of consanguinity through the agency of cousin marriages. Rumford and his wife, for instance, were third cousins, and they detested each other. And when Rumford's class was diagrammed by Kittredge, it resembled not so much as the hard ball-like knot known as a monkey's fist. Oh, that's what it resembled. So when Rumford's class was diagrammed by Kittredge, rather, it resembled nothing so much as the hard ball-like knot of a monkey's fist. We got that. So Walter Kittredge often floundered in his The American Philosopher Kings, trying to translate the atmosphere of Rumford's class into words. Like the college professor he was, Kittredge groped only for big words and finding no apt ones. He coined a lot of untranslatable new ones.
Wow.
Okay, let's page 23. Let's keep going. I want to get to get to the second chapter. Here we go. All of Kittredge's jargon, only one term has ever found its way into conversation. The term is unneurotic courage. It was that sort of courage, of course, that carried Winston Niles Rumford out into space. It was pure courage, not only pure of lusts for fame and money, but pure of any drives that smack of the misfit or screwball. There are, incidentally, two strong common words that would have served handsomely, one or the other, in place of all of Kittredge's jargon. The words were style and gallantry. When Rumford became the first person to own a private spaceship, paying $58 million out of his own pocket for it, that was style. And when the governments of the Earth suspended all space exploration because of the chronosynclastic infundibula, and Rumford announced that it was going to Mars, Rumford announced he was going to Mars, rather, that was style. So we have style and gallantry. When Rumford announced that he was taking a perfectly tremendous dog along, as though a spaceship were nothing more than a sophisticated sports car, as through a trip to Mars were little more than a spin down the Connecticut Turnpike, that was style. when it was unknown what would happen if a spaceship went into a Cronus Synclastic in Fundibulum, and Rumford had steered a course straight to the middle of one. That was also in gallantry. Yeah, that was gallantry for sure. So, to contrast Malachi Constant of Hollywood with Winston Nell's Rumford of Newport and Eternity, everything Rumford did, he did with style, making all of mankind look good. Everything Constant did, he did in style aggressively, loudly, childishly, wastefully, making himself and mankind look bad. So Constant bristled with courage, but it was anything but unneurotic. Every courageous thing he had ever done had been motivated by a spitefulness, and by goals from childhood that made him fear and seem puny indeed. Constant, having just heard from Rumford that he was to be mated with Rumford's wife on Mars, looked away from Rumford to the Museum of Remains along the wall. Constant's hands were clasped together, tightening on each other pulsingly. Constant cleared his throat several times, then he whistled thinly between his tongue and the roof of his mouth. In all, he was behaving like a man who was waiting for a terrible pain to pass. He closed his eyes and sucked in air between his teeth. "Doody-doo, Mr. Rumford," he said clearly. He said softly. He opened his eyes. "Mars?" he said. "Mars," said Rumford. "Of course, that isn't your ultimate destination. Or Mercury either." "Mercury?" said Constant. He made an unbecoming quack of that lovely name. "Your destination is Titan," said Rumford. "But you visit Mars and Mercury and Earth again before you get there." It is crucial to understand at what point in the history of punctual space exploration it was that Malachi Constant received the news of his prospective visits to Mars, Mercury, Earth, and Titan. The state of mind on Earth with regard to space exploration was much like the state of mind in Europe with regard to exploration of the Atlantic before Christopher Columbus set out. There were these important differences, however. The monsters between space explorers and their goals were not imaginary, but numerous, hideous, various, and uniformly cataclysmic. The cost of even a small expedition was enough to ruin most nations, and it was a virtual certainty that no expedition could increase the wealth of its sponsors. In short, on the basis of horse sense and the best scientific information, there was nothing good to be said for the exploration of space. The time was long past when one nation could seem more glorious than another by hurling some heavy object into nothingness. Galactic Spacecraft, a corporation controlled by Malachi Constant, had, as a matter of fact, received the very last order for such a showpiece. A rocket 300 feet high and 36 feet in diameter had actually been built. But the fire order never came. The ship was called simply the Whale, and was fitted with living quarters for 5 passengers. What had brought everything to such an abrupt halt was the discovery of the Cronus Synclastic Infundibula. They had been discovered mathematically on the basis of bizarre flight patterns of unmanned ships sent out and supposedly in advance of men. The discovery of the Cronus Synclastic Infundibula said to mankind, in effect, "What makes you think you're going anywhere?" It was a situation made to order for American fundamentalist preachers. They were quicker than philosophers, or historians for that matter, to talk sense about the truncated age of space. 2 hours after firing the Whale, this was called off indefinitely. The Reverend Bobby Denton shouted at his lovely... Pardon me, sorry. The Reverend Bobby Denton shouted at his love crusade in Wheeling, West Virginia. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us down, and there confound their language, so they may not understand another speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name it was called Babel. Because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And okay, I can't get back. Okay, so sorry. From thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Okay, get it out of your system, Jason. Get it out of your system. Right. Okay, we continue. Wow. Bobby Denton spitted his audience on a bright and loving gaze, and proceeded to roast it while over the coals of its own iniquity. You know what? Fuck it. We're on page 27. I'm taking a drink. I am taking a drink. Wow. This is fun. I am having a good time. All right. So Bobby Denton and his speech there. The tower of it was called Babel, whatever you want to call it. And henceforth the Lord scattered upon them face of the earth. All right, gotcha. Bobby Denton spitted his audience on a bright and loving gaze, and proceeded to roast it while over the coals of its own iniquity. Are these not Bible times? He said. Have we not builded of steel and pride, an abomination far taller than the Tower of Babel of old? And did we not mean, like those builders of old, to get right into heaven with it? And haven't we heard it so many times that the language of scientists, it's international? They all use the same Latin Greek words for things. And that they all talk the language of numbers. This seemed a particularly damning piece of evidence to Denton, and the Love Crusaders agreed bleakly, without quite understanding why. So why should we cry out in surprise and pain now when God says to us what he said to the people who builded the Tower of Babel? No, get away from there. You aren't going to heaven or anywhere else with that thing. Scatter, you hear? Quit talking the language of science to each other. Nothing will be restrained from you which you have not imagined to do, if you all keep on talking the language of science to each other, and I don't want that. I, your Lord God, on high, want things restrained from you. So you will quit talking and thinking about crazy towers and rockets to heaven, and start thinking about how to be better neighbours and husbands and wives and daughters and sons. Don't look to the rockets for salvation. Look to your homes and to your churches. Bobby Denton's voice grew hoarse and hushed, much like mine. You want to fly through space? God has already given you the most wonderful spaceship in all creation. Yes, speed. You want speed? The spaceship God has given you goes 60,000 miles an hour, and will keep on running that speed for all eternity. If God wills it, you want a spaceship that will carry men in comfort? You've got it. It won't carry just a rich man and his dog, or just 5 men or 10 men. No. God is no piker. He's given you a spaceship that will carry billions of men, women, and children. Yes. And they don't have to stay strapped in the chairs or wear fishbowls over their heads. No. not on God's spaceship. The people on God's spaceship can go swimming and walk in sunshine and play baseball and go ice skating, go for family rides in the family automobile on Sunday after church, and a family chicken dinner. Bobby Denton nodded. Yes, he said. And if anybody thinks his God is mean for putting things out there in space to stop us from flying out there, just let him remember the spaceship of God that was already given to us. And if we don't have to buy the fuel for it, and we don't have to worry and fret over what kind of fuel to use, no, God worries about that. God told us what we had to do on this wonderful spaceship. He wrote the rules so anybody could understand them. You don't have to be a physicist or great chemist or an Albert Einstein to understand them, no. And he didn't make a whole lot of rules either. They tell me that if they were to fire the whale, they would have to make 11,000 separate checks before they could make sure that it was ready to go. Is a valve open, or is a valve closed? Is a wire right? Is a tank full? And so on and on and on. 11,000 things to check. Here on God's spaceship, God gives us only 10 things to check. And not for any little trip to some big dead poisonous stones out in space, no. But for a trip to the kingdom of heaven. Think about it. Where would you rather be tomorrow? On Mars or in the kingdom of heaven? You know what the checklist is on God's round green spaceship? Do I have to tell you? You want to hear God's countdown? The Love Crusaders shouted back. 10, said Bobby Denton. Do you convert thy neighbour's name? No, sorry. I turned the page on that one. Do you covet thy neighbour's house, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is thy neighbour's? No, cried the Love Crusaders. 9, said Bobby Denton. Do you bear false witness against thy neighbour? No, cried the Crusaders. 8, said Bobby Denton. Do you steal? No, cried the Love Crusaders. 7, said Bobby Denton. Do you commit adultery? No, said the Love Crusaders. 6, said Bobby Denton. Do you kill? No, said the Love Crusaders. 5, said Bobby Denton. Do you honour thy father and thy mother? Yes, cried the Crusaders. 4, said Bobby Denton. Do you remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Yes, cried the Love Crusaders. 3, said Bobby Denton. Do you take the name of the Lord, thy God, in vain? No, cried the Love Crusaders. 2, said Bobby Denton. Do you make any graven images? No, cried the Love Crusaders. 1, cried Bobby Denton. Do you put any gods before the one true Lord, thy God? No, cried the Love Crusaders. Blast off, shouted Bobby Denton joyfully. Paradise, here we come. Blast off, children. Amen. Amen. Well, muttered Malachi Constant. Malachi. There, in the chimney-like room, under the staircase in Newport, it looks like the messenger is finally going to be used. What was that? Said Rumford. My name, it means faithful messenger, said Constant. What's the message? Sorry, said Rumford. I know nothing about any message. He cocked his head quizzically. Somebody said something to you about a message? Constant turned his palms upward. I mean, what am I going to do? Or what am I going to go through all this trouble to get to Triton for? Titan, Rumford corrected him. Titan, Triton, said Constant. What the blast would I go there for? Blast was weak, prissy, eagle, scoutish word for Constant to use, and it took him a moment to realise why he had used it. Blast was what space cadets on television said when a meteorite carried away a control surface, or the navigator turned out to be a space pirate from the planet Zircon. He stood. Why the hell should I go there? You do, I promise you, said Rumford. Constant went over to the window. some of his arrogant strength returning. "I tell you right now," he said, "I'm not going." "Sorry to hear that," said Rumford. "I'm supposed to do something for you when I get there?" said Constant. "No," said Rumford. "Then why are you sorry?" said Constant. "Well, what's it to you?" "Nothing. I'm only sorry for you. You'll really be missing out on something." "Like what?" "Well, the most pleasant climate imaginable, for one thing," said Rumford. "Climate?" said Constant, contemptuously. "With houses in Hollywood, the Vale of Kashmir, Acapulco, Manitoba, Tahiti, Paris, Bermuda, Rome, New York, and Cape Town. I should leave Earth in search of a happier climate?" There's more to Titan than just the climate," said Rumford. "The women, for instance, are the most beautiful creatures between the sun and Betelgeuse." Constant scoffed bitterly. "Women?" he said. "You think I'm having trouble getting beautiful women? You think I'm love-starved, and the only way I'll ever get close to a beautiful woman is to climb on a rocket ship and head to one of Saturn's moons? Are you kidding? I've had women so beautiful, anybody between the sun and Betelgeuse would sit down and cry if the women said so much as hello to them." He took out his billfold and slipped it. He took out his billfold and slipped from it a photograph of his most recent conquest. There was no question about it. The girl in the photograph was staggeringly beautiful. She was Miss Canal Zone, a runner-up in the Miss Universe contest, and in fact far more beautiful than the women of the contest. Her beauty had frightened the judges. Constant handed Rumford the photograph. "They got anything like that on Titan?" he said. Rumford studied the photograph respectfully, handed it back to Constant, and said, "No," he said, "nothing like that on Titan." "Okay," said Constant, feeling very much in control of his own destiny again. "Climate, beautiful women, what else?" "Nothing else," said Rumford mildly. He shrugged. Art objects, if you like art." "I've got the biggest private art collection in the world," said Constant. Constant had inherited his famous art collection. The collection had been made by his father, or rather by the agents of his father, and it was scattered through the museums all over the world. Each piece plainly marked as a part of the Constant collection. The collection had been made and then deployed in this manner on the recommendation of the Director of Public Relations of Magnum Opus Incorporated, the corporation whose sole purpose was to manage the Constant affairs. The purpose of the collection had been to prove how generous and useful and sensitive billionaires could be. The collection had turned out to be a perfectly gorgeous investment as well. "That takes care of art." "That takes care of art," said Rumford. Constant was about to return the photograph of Miss Canal Zone to his billfold when he felt that he had not one photograph, but two. There was a photograph behind that of Miss Canal Zone. Well, whatever. He supposed that this photograph was one of perhaps Miss Calzone's predecessors, and he thought that he might as well show Rumford her too, to show Rumford what a celestial Lulu he had given the gate to. There's another one," said Constant, holding out a second photograph to Rumford. Rumford made no move to take the photograph. He didn't even bother to look at it. I'm just getting comfortable. Wow. Okay. So Rumford made no move to take the photograph, and he didn't even bother to look at it. He looked instead into Constant's eyes and grinned roguishly. Constant looked down at the photograph that had been ignored. He found that it was not a photograph of Miss Canal Zone's predecessor. It was a photograph that Rumford had slipped there. It was no ordinary photograph. Through its surface was glossy and its margins white. Within the margins lay shimmering depths. The effect was much like that of a rectangular glass window in the surface of a clear, shallow coral bay. At the bottom of okay, let me start again. Sorry. Let me just get this right. It was a photograph that Rumford had slipped in. It was no ordinary photograph, though its surface was glossy and its margins white. Within the margins lay shimmering depths. The effect was much like that of a rectangular glass window in the surface of a clear, shallow coral bay. At the bottom of that seeming coral bay were 3 women, one white, one gold, and one brown. They looked up at Constant, begging him to come to them, to make them whole with love. Their beauty was to the beauty of Miss Canalzone as the glory of the sun was to the glory of a lightning bug. Constant sank into the wing chair again. He had to look away from all that beauty in order to keep himself from bursting into tears. "You can keep that picture if you like," said Rumford. "It's wallet size." Burn. Constant could think of nothing to say. "My wife will still be with you when you get to Titan," said Rumford, "but she won't interfere if you want to frolic with these 3 young ladies. Your son will be with you too. He's quite broad-minded, as Patrice." "Son?" said Constant. He had no son. "Yes, a fine boy named Chrono," said Rumford. "Chrono," said Constant. "A Martian name," said Rumford. He's born on Mars, by you, out of Patrice." "Patrice?" said Constant. "My wife," said Rumford. He had become quite transparent. His voice was becoming tinny, too, as though coming from a cheap radio. "Things fly this way and that way, my boy," he said. "With or without messages, it's chaos. And no mistake, for the universe is just being born. It's the great becoming that makes the light and the heat and the motion, and bangs you hither to yon." "Predictions, predictions, predictions," said Rumford musingly. "Is there anything else I should tell you? Oh, yes. This child of yours, it's a boy. He is to be named Chrono. Chrono will pick up a little strip of metal on Mars," said Rumford, "and he will call it his good luck piece. Keep your eye on that good luck piece, Mr. Constant. It's unbelievably important." Winston Niles Rumford vanished slowly, beginning with the ends of his fingers and ending with his grin. The grin remained some time after the rest of him had gone. "See you on Titan," said the grin, and then it was gone. "Is it all over, Moncrief?" said Miss Winston Niles Rumford, calling down to the butler from the top of the spiral staircase. "Yes, ma'am, he's left," said the butler. "And the dog, too." "And that Mr. Constant," said Miss Rumford, said Patrice. She was behaving like an invalid, tottering, blinking hard, making a voice like wind in the treetops. She wore a long white dressing gown whose soft folds formed a counterclockwise spiral in harmony with the white staircase. The train of the gown cascaded down the top riser, making Patrice continuous with the architecture of the mansion. It was her tall, straight figure that mattered most in the display. The details of her face were insignificant. A cannonball substituted for her head would have suited the grand composition just as well. But Patrice did have a face, and an interesting one. It could be said that she looked like a buck-toothed Indian brave. But anyone who said that would have to add quickly that she looked marvellous. Her face, like the face of Malachi Constant, was one of a kind, like a surprising variation on a familiar theme, a variation that observers would make observers think, yes, that would be another very nice way for people to look. What Patrice had done with her face, actually, was what any plain girl would do. She had overlaid it with dignity, suffering, intelligence, and a piquant dash of bitchiness. "Yes," said Constant from below, "that Mr. Constant is still here." He was in plain view, leaning against a column in the arch that opened onto the foyer. But he was so low in the composition, so lost in architectural details, he was almost invisible. "Oh," said Patrice. "How you do?" It was an empty greeting. "How do you do?" said Constant. "I can only appeal to your gentlemanly instincts," said Patrice, "in asking you not to spread the story of our meeting with my husband far and wide. I can well understand how tremendous the temptation must be." "Yes," said Constant. "I could sell my story for a lot of money, pay off the mortgage on the homestead, and become an internationally famous figure. I could hobnob with the great and near great and perform before the crowned heads of Europe." "You'll pardon me," said Patrice, "if I fail to appreciate sarcasm and all the other brilliant nuances of your no doubt famous wit, Mr. Constant. These visits of my husband's make me tremendously ill." "You never seen him before? Or you never see him anymore, do you?" "Sorry. You never see him anymore, do you?" said Constant. "I saw him the first time he materialized," said Patrice, "and that was enough to make me ill for the rest of my days." I liked him very much," said Constant. "The insane, on occasion, are not without their charms," said Patrice. "Insane?" said Constant. "As a man of the world, Mr. Constant, wouldn't you say that any person who made complicated and highly improbable prophecies was a madman?" "A man or woman, I guess, whatever. I worded it wrong, but we'll carry on." "Well," said Constant, "is it really very crazy to tell a man who has access to the biggest ship ever built that he's going out into space?" This bit of news about the accessibility of a spaceship to Constant startled Patrice. Wow, 38 pages. All right, let's keep going. Oh, water break. Jesus, wow. Sorry, let's continue. It startled her so much that she took a step back from the head of the staircase, separated herself from the rising spiral. A small step backward transformed her into what she was, a frightened, lonely woman in a tremendous house. "You have a spaceship, do you?" she said. "A company I control has custody of your one," said Constant. "You've heard of it? The Whale?" "Yes," said Patrice. "My company sold it to the government," said Constant. "I think they'd be delighted if someone would buy it back at 5 cents on the dollar." "Much luck to you on your expedition," said Patrice. Constant bowed. "Much luck to you on yours," he said. He left without another word. In crossing the bright zodiac on the foyer floor, he sensed that the spiral staircase now swept down rather than up. Constant became the bottommost point in a whirlpool of fate. As he walked out the door, he was delightfully aware of his pulling the aplomb of the Rumford mansion right with him. All right, that didn't make much sense. As he walked out of the door, he was delightfully aware of the pulling the aplomb. Whatever. Okay, carry on. Since it was foredrained that he and Beatrice were to come together again to produce a child named Chrono, Constant was under no compunction to seek and woo her. Oh, sorry, water break got caught up with me there. To send her so much as a get well card. He could go about his business, he thought, and haughtily Beatrice would have to damn well come to him like any other bimbo. Okay. So he was laughing when he put on his dark glasses and false beard and let himself out through the little iron door on the wall. The limousine was back, and so was the crowd. The police held open a narrow path to the limousine door. Constance scuttled down it to reach the limousine. The path closed like the Red Sea behind the children of Israel. The cries of the crowd, taken together, a collective cry of indignation and pain. The crowd, having been promised nothing, felt cheated, having received nothing. Men and boys began to rock the Constance limousine. The chauffeur put the limousine in gear, made it creep through the sea of raging flesh. A bald man made an attempt on Constance's life with a hot dog, stabbed at the window glass with it, splayed the bun, broke the frankfurter, left a sickly sunburst of mustard and relish. "Ya, ya, ya!" yelled a pretty young woman, and she showed Constance what she had probably never showed any other man. She showed him her two front upper teeth were false. She let those two front teeth fall out of place. She shrieked like a witch. A boy climbed on the hood, blocking the chauffeur's view. He ripped off the windshield wipers. He threw them into the crowd. It took the limousine 3/4 of an hour to reach a fringe of the crowd, and on the fringe were not the lunatics, but the nearly sane. Only on the fringe did the shouts become coherent. "Tell us!" shouted a man, and he was merely fed up, not enraged. "We've got a right!" shouted a woman. She showed her two fine children to Constance. Another woman told Constance what it was the crowd felt it had a right to. "We've got a right to know what's going on," she cried. The riot then was an exercise in science and the theology, a seeking after clues by the living as to what life was all about. The chauffeur, seeing at last a clear road before him, pressed the accelerator to the floor. The limousine zoomed away. A huge billboard flashed by. "Let's take a friend to the church of our choice on Sunday," it said. That's the end of chapter 1.